So, our first speaker is Dr. Sean Owen, and he will be speaking tonight about Bishop Timothy Rees, Bishop of Llandaf, the monk and the hymn writer. I was talking a few minutes ago, I have some attraction to, because I pass his grave almost every day when I take the dog for a walk in Llandaf, and I pass his grave. Also, once a month, I administer the Eucharist in the cathedral, which is next door to our home here in Llandaf, and the plaque, which we will see later on, in memory of Bishop Timothy Rees, is in the Lady Chapel. And I always think of him as I pass to the back of the altar. But the speaker tonight, Dr. Sean Owen, was born in Bangor, like the best people, of course. We make sure of those who were born in St David's Hospital. He graduated in Welsh and theology and bilingualism, and he also has doctorate in bilingual education. He lives in Wales, England, Scotland, and Australia. So I think he would rejoice not only in Wales's victory, but also Scotland. At the moment, he is associate tutor in the Trova Padan Sant in Llandaf. He's a poet, performed poetry in Welsh, English, and sometimes Latin, and has won the National Eisteddfod Chair. He contributes poems to Facebook, very often on topical subjects, and I'm one of his regular audience. He's published his latest poem, Rhwng Pla a Phla, jointly with the artist Iwan Bala. And he was established as canon poet in Bangor Cathedral in 2023. So welcome, Sean Owen. We very much appreciate your willingness to speak on this subject. So over to you, and we look forward to hearing more about Bishop Timothy Rees. Thank you very much for the presentation. It reminds me of wandering the world, as I have. Yeah, can you see that? Can you all see that? The title? Timothy Rees.
Right,
yes.
Right. Well,
That's one thing to be thankful for.
Well,
I must say, and I must admit, two things at the beginning here. The title, the Mynach ar y Mynydd, the monk and the hymn writer, owes more to Cynghanedd, since I like writing poetry in Cynghanedd, than with the contents of the presentation. Because although he was a monk and a hymn writer, he was much more than that. The second thing I'd like to admit is that I am very indebted to what I read by our second speaker tonight, Professor Denzil Morgan, on Timothy Rees. And that's what led me into looking into more detail of his life and the other achievements of his life. So we shall go on. I don't seem to be able to move on to the next slide. Right. Yes, indeed. So this is just a summary of what we shall be looking at tonight. I'm not going to read it out. But we begin looking at his life, and then the most important features I felt, and of course this is only a personal opinion and subjective. What I felt was important for us to remember of his life and work for today. So, facts of his life. He was born in Llanbadarn Treveglwys, which is between Aberarth and Cross Inn in Cardiganshire, as it was then. So in a rural area, but he was a member of a maritime family. His father was a sea captain, and two brothers of his went to the sea and also became captains. There is no evidence, as far as I could see, that he was ever attracted to the sea, but certainly that was the family background and context. His brother, John Lambert Rees, was 12 years older than he was. He became a missionary with an American missionary society to China, but when he was in Shanghai, where there was an Anglican community, he turned to the church. They were Congregationalists, the family were Congregationalists. In Llanbadarn Treveglwys, but John Rees turned to the Anglican Church and on the Anglo-Catholic branch of the church when he was in Shanghai. And he joined the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which became USPG later on, United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was the missionary society, the most Catholic missionary society in the Anglican Church. And it is obvious that he did have a great influence on his younger brother, Timothy, and supported him as well throughout his life. And he lived after Timothy's death and wrote a biography of him. And John Lambert Rees, after returning to China in 1906, became rector of Llanddowror. He was also canon of St David's and chancellor later on. And in Llanddowror, he stayed for the rest of his life. In the meantime, Timothy went to Ysgol Ardwyn in Aberystwyth, and he was still a Congregationalist then, and his original intention was to be a doctor. But he'd also considered becoming a minister with the Congregationalists, but he didn't follow that particular either of those routes. He went on then to complete his secondary education in a school which was attached to the St David's, a church school, of course, in Lampeter, and then prepared for the ministry in St Michael's College, which was newly established in Aberdare. And of course, the predecessor, as it happens, of Padarn Sant by now, which is on the site of the old St Michael's College in Cardiff, in Llandaff. And this is, the first is a picture of the old St Michael's in Aberdare. And thence he went to minister in the parish of Mountain Ash. The Diocese of Llandaff at the time, the evangelical tradition was very strong there, partly because of the influence of Bishop Olivant, a bishop who became a priest came from Manchester to St David's in Lampeter and learned Welsh and was in favour of promoting the language, and then became Bishop of Llandaff. So the diocese in its entirety was evangelical in tone, but around Aberdare and the next door parish, Mountain Ash, there was a collection of parishes which were more Anglo-Catholic, and in Mountain Ash, the Timothy Rees ministered at the turn of the century. Then he returned to his old college as chaplain and a Welsh tutor. And that's one of the few things I can say that I've been one of his successors as a Welsh tutor, and I still do that at Padarn Sant. There wasn't much emphasis on the Welsh language in the church, the Anglican Church in Wales as it was then, but it had to be recognised that if you were to minister and to evangelise effectively amongst most of the Welsh people, including the people of the valleys at that time, then the Welsh language was important, not just for cultural reasons, but for practical reasons. So the college did recognise that by appointing a tutor in Welsh, and that was Timothy Rees, and he was responsible for teaching Welsh to the non-Welsh speaking ordinands. And there, from then, he felt a calling to the monastic life and joined the community of the Resurrection in Murfield. And this is a picture, the one below, of Murfield, of an aerial view, and you can see that it's quite an extensive area and buildings and sites. And of course, it's still important in the Anglican Communion till today. And the head at the time was Charles Gore. And he was important in the development of Anglo-Catholicism with a social and evangelical emphasis in the life of Timothy Rees, as we will see later on. During the Great War, the First World War, Timothy Rees served as a chaplain, including as chaplain during the Battle of Passchendaele, and he won the Military Cross for bravery, for venturing out several times into no man's land to retrieve the wounded from there. And towards the end of the war, he was a chaplain in a hospital for soldiers who were suffering from venereal diseases. So his experience throughout those years was very wide-ranging. And he himself became a principal of the community at Murfield from 1922 until 1928, and actually resided there as a head of a theological college would. But during the previous period, between becoming being a member of the community and working as a chaplain in the war, he spent periods as a missionary at home and abroad, including in New Zealand and Sri Lanka. So once again, you have the width and breadth of his interests and indeed of his ministry. And then he was appointed Bishop of Llandaf, and this is the plaque that Sean referred to, which
gan Sean gynharach yn yr eglwys.
This is in the cathedral, and he is buried in the grounds, in the shadow of the cathedral, literally in the shadow of the cathedral. Before he died, fairly suddenly in April 1939. So that's his life. What about looking now at some of the features of his ministry and his thoughts? Now, he was, of his period, at least of his period in Mountain Ash, rejected the split between the evangelical and the Catholic. Denzil, in his chapter in his volume Cedr na Ganrif, the title is The Successor to the Saints, and I would agree with that, because he was certainly in the Catholic tradition, but also he had this heartfelt feeling for missionary work and for social action, as we shall see. And you can see from that quotation that a man may be a Catholic and an evangelical too, the way he felt the necessity for linking the altar and the pulpit. And that was very important throughout his whole life. Of course, he did believe in encouraging people to live a better life, of course. But a better life wasn't enough. You also needed a new life. And because of that, I think he saw the excitement of past revivals, and of course, the revival which he lived through, the Evan Roberts' revival. But what I mean by social gospel plus the social gospel, which had taken root, had become very popular by Harnack in Germany, for instance, at the end of the 19th century, had become a force to be reckoned with by the first half of the 20th century. But the tendency was for many to, well, at least in the way that the social gospel was presented, that was the be-all and end-all of the gospel. That's what we were supposed to do, full stop. That you had to challenge social inequality and injustice and improving the situation, particularly of the people who were victims or who suffered in society. But Timothy Rees, exactly like Charles Gore, wasn't satisfied with that alone. That is, yes, there was a need, and a great need indeed, by the end of the 20s and the early 30s to challenge social injustice, but at the same time to offer something more to people. So the social gospel and the spiritual gospel, if you like, were not in contention. They cooperated, and that quotation is typical of his attitude towards Christianity in life. That there was no what was secular and what was sacred. They were both. To quote another poet, it's everything is sacred. And he believed in what he says there, the condescension of the eternal word. Now, by today, the word condescension has and condescend and condescending have had very negative connotations. Some sort of fake sympathy with people, looking down on them, or who are in a lower situation than ourselves. But John Wesley uses the word condescension, the condescending God. And what he means by that is the original meaning of the word. That is, if somebody is down, it is our place to join them, to get down with them, empathy with them. And there are some people who use that word in a rather negative word, and it's shameful that they do so. But it is a fellow feeling by existing and being with those who are suffering or in difficulties. So the condescending God was Timothy Rees's God. And he was strongly in his criticism of what is noted in that quote, the next quotation. And as I said, believed strongly in combining social action with the spread of the gospel, the spiritual gospel and eternal gospel. To move on, as regards nationhood and nationalism, he had a sort of strange attitude towards disestablishment. I think chiefly because of the disendowment which would happen. That is, that the church in Wales would be made poorer
golli
if they
yr
lost
gynhaliaeth
the
ariannol
financial
oedd
support
yno
that was
drwy
available
Eglwys
through the
Loegr.
Church of England.
Ond
But
cafodd ei ofnaf o
his
ddim
fears were
gwireddu,
not
ac
realised,
erbyn
and by
1934 mae o'n dweud
1934,
am
he
datgysylltu
mentioned the
a
disestablishment
sefydlu Prifysgol
and the
Cymru.
establishment of the
Yym,
University of
Mae o'n
Wales,
sôn amdanyn nhw
that
fel dau o
the
brif
main
ddigwyddiadau o
events
bwys
of
i fywyd,
importance in his life
ac yn dod â'r rhyddid
and
i'r
brought
eglwys,
freedom
un
to the
ohonyn nhw,
church
a'r llall
and the
goldeini
latter
i'r
light to the
genedl.
nation.
Ynglŷn â
Concerning
chenedlaetholdeb,
nationalism,
doedd o ddim
he
yn
wasn't
bleidiol
in
i
favour of
genedlaetholdeb
political
wleidyddol
nationalism
i
or
hunanlywodraeth,
self-government,
felly.
say.
Dwi'm yn gwybod oedd o'n
I don't know whether he
feirniadol
was,
chwaith
I don't think he was
faint
critical
hynny,
either to
ond
that degree,
i
but
safbwynt
his
o'r hyn,
viewpoint on
oedd
this
o'n
was,
mae'r
excuse me,
ffôn yn grwnian yma. Doedd o roedd ei
his
bwyslais
emphasis
ar
was
yr
on
diwylliannol
the
a'r
cultural side and
ieithyddol
linguistic side
yn hytrach
rather
na'r
than the
gwleidyddol,
political,
fel mae'r dyfyniad
as
yna yn
the
ei ddweud.
quotation
Ond
says.
yn sgil
But
hynny,
following that,
oedd y
he was the
cyntaf i
first
enerch
to
dros
address the governing
llywodraethol
body
yr
of
Eglwys
the
yng
Church
Nghymru
in Wales
yn
in the
Gymraeg,
Welsh language.
ac mi oedd o
And
o safbwynt yr
as
berthynas
regards the
rhwng
relationship
cenhedloedd
between
yn
nations,
gry
he
o
was strongly
blaid
in favour
dod â
of
phobl
bringing
a phobloedd
people
at ei gilydd.
together.
One nation
So
cannot
one nation cannot hurt another nation without hurting itself.
Ac oedd o yn aml
He often, the term that he used, that term nation, referred to Wales rather than merely the British state. So, as regards ecumenism, again, we see some duality here. He respected the work of all the other denominations, particularly in the valleys during his ministry there. And when he was enthroned and established as bishop, he expressed publicly his appreciation of the presence of representatives of other Christian denominations in the service of the events surrounding his enthronement, and was strongly in favour of avoiding conflict insofar as that was possible between the different Christian denominations. And we could disagree, but we don't have to hate. But every time he uses the term the church, we need to ask, well, what exactly does he mean? The church in its entirety, in general, or the Anglican Church in Wales, or the Anglican Communion worldwide and generally. And in looking at his sermons, I very often had to ask myself, all right, what is the church? What does it mean? Because, of course, he had very strong adherence to the Anglican Church, and the Church in Wales. And because of that, he asked, when he talks of unity, does he mean the unity between Christians generally, or unity between the different sects, shall we say, such as the evangelicals and the Catholic, the low and high church, so to speak. And then we come to his hymns. And we haven't time, unfortunately. It would be a lecture in itself to look at his work as a hymn writer. Most of them, those recorded, are in English, but some are also in Welsh. He has 2 hymns in Caneuon Ffydd. What I saw in them was that that personal relationship with the Godhead is central to them, be that as the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit. And that goes in tandem with his life and his ministry. You can't just accept what the Bible says as principles, but you have to go out to the world and live your faith. And I saw some echoes of the work of Stewart Kennedy, the famous chaplain in the First World War, as was called Woodbine Willie, the one who gave out cigarettes to the troops, and who said something similar after that. To those I owed Christ's love, I fobbed off with a cigarette. So self-criticism. But he was a man who was absolutely committed, as was Timothy Rees, to action and social action, which went hand in hand with the work of the evangelist. And in one of his hymns, he has the line, the very striking line, nailed about Jesus, nailed to the cross of greed. But when we come to this hymn in Caneuon Ffydd, his most well-known hymn, the meaning of the word church there is totally unambiguous, I think. So he talks about i'w hoffeiriad, I have scoped unto his ministers and bishops, give them a vision. And I very often have wanted to use this hymn in leading services, but when I'm somewhere other than one of the churches of the church in Wales, I can't, because it excludes everyone else with that reference to priests and bishops. So, for me, he could have put something such as our leaders and our ministers or something like that, which would have worked for all denominations. That would have made the hymn much more useful for people, but it shows how he veered between ecumenism and his obvious love towards the church. And to finish, the next question, was he a bishop of the people? The one who won that title, the people's bishop, was Bishop John Charles Jones, J.C. Jones, Bishop of Bangor in the 50s.
oherwydd yn wahanol
because
i'w
very unlike his
rhagflaenwyr,
predecessors,
J.C. Jones yn
J.C.
hoff
Jones
iawn o gymysgu'r
was very
bobl
fond
a
of mixing with the
gerdded
people and of
lawr
walking
stryd fawr
down Bangor High
ac yn
Street,
taro sgwrs ag
chatting
unrhyw
to
un,
people.
gobeithio
And I hope
cyn diwedd
that
y
before the
gyfres
end of the series,
Gofal ein
Gwynsian,
gawn ni
that we will have
sesiwn ar
a session
J.C.
about
Jones.
J.C. Jones.
Ond yn ei ffordd
But
ei
in
hun,
his own way,
roedd, dwi'n meddwl,
I think that Timothy
Timothy
Rees
Rees
was
hefyd
also
yn esgob
the
y
people's
bobl
bishop
ac yn haeddu
and
y
deserves
teitl yna
that
hefyd.
title also.
Felly,
So,
diolch
thank
am
you
wylio
for
a gwrando.
watching and listening. Well, thank you, Sean. That was most interesting. Obviously, Timothy Rees was... may I ask for questions now, if there are any? We have a few minutes.
Amdani, Isley. Diolch yn fawr. Diolch yn fawr. Diolch Sean, a diolch yn ywedig I Sean Aled am cyflwyniad.
And since nobody's jumped in.
Oh,
Ainsley, you've...
yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Sean, particularly for that extremely interesting presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I'll keep them to the informal session at 8:30. But a question which comes apparent to me is, what was his, why do you think he turned from the Congregationalist to the church, and specifically to the, shall we say, the Anglo-Catholic branch of the church? Was it the idea that the church was rooted in the early saints, or was it something to do with the sacramental side, together with the word? And how would you define Anglo-Catholicism in that period? We use it today. We think of people who are obviously centered their spirituality on the sacraments and the Mass. The prayers to the saints and so on. But in that period, what was the main tenets which would Timothy Rees would adhere to, which were very important to him? Well, thank you. That's a very comprehensive question. He says somewhere, and I haven't got the quotation in front of me at the moment, the importance of structure, I think, that in nonconformity, there was a lot of freedom, of course, yes, but that freedom could go into any direction, ultimately. So I think it was the importance of the fact that you had a structure or basis, and the sacraments and the liturgy were basis of that. But it is obvious also, I think, that he was aware, very much aware, of the importance of the Celtic background and the saints. So one of his hymns is to St. Taylor, of course, linked with Llandaf itself, of course. So I think that his Anglo-Catholicism, we tend to think today of the Puseyism and so on, and the Oxford movement. But I think that he was a very thoughtful Anglo-Catholicism. And the fact that he says, as one of the quotations which I put up in the presentation, that he believes in bringing the evangelical and the Catholic together is a witness to that. Is evidence of that. Well, question of order is associated with the order of bishops rather than, but we'll come to that in the chat, I think. Thank you. I hope you've had an opportunity to have a little break. So, thank you, Sean Aled, once again. And now we welcome Professor Denzil Morgan. And Denzil tonight will talk about D. Ambrose Jones, Gydweli, the last of the old literary parsons. Ambrose Jones contributed a lot to the culture, and Denzil says that his talk will follow his work and his life. Denzil's work is also, it could be said, has permanent value, and we're very grateful to him for all the work that he's done over the years, particularly as one of the joint editors of Gobel and Gwynllan volumes. And Denzil himself has also already contributed. And he comes from Morriston, in Swansea Valley, went to Bangor and Lampeter, and is now Emeritus Professor and a Minister, the Baptist Church of North Tavy. So if there is a link between our speakers tonight, the focus is certainly, Ceredigion is that focus. He's published on religion, and his latest volume is Gras Gobaith a Gogoniant, the work of Emrys Ab Iwan. So welcome, Denzil, and thank you for your contribution. We look forward. Thank you, Sean, and thank you both, Seans, for your contributions tonight. In a chapter on his book, Ansawdd y Seilia, which was published in 1972, R. Gerard Jones mentions D. Ambrose Jones, Vicar of Gydweli, and pays particular attention to his collection of essays, Nodion Llenyddol, published by Sbyrrel Press Carmarthen in 1920. It's apparent that Gerard Jones knew hardly anything about the author, and he expresses pleased surprise at the contents of his work. This is a volume of substance, and we can see how wide his interests were. It contains essays on individual writers such as Byron, Ieuan Brydydd Hir, Alun, Panter Celyn, Ellis Wyn of Las Ynys, and Hooker, on subjects such as philosophy and religion, miracles, congregational singing, and so on. And the essays aren't empty rhetoric, but rather intelligent and learned discussions set against a background of wide-ranging knowledge. The book contains very interesting material written in an extremely free and unassuming style. Gerard Jones expresses surprise, in fact, not only that such a book, books of such quality had appeared at all, and that the heirs of the old literary parsons were still abroad, but that the volume was written with such freshness of spirit. And he says this: Ambrose Jones was a special personality. He was also special in that he lacked any bitterness or argumentative feelings. We must remember that he wrote these essays in 1920, on the eve of disestablishment, in a period of fierce controversy and of a religious Cold War as heated as any other civil war. And yet, he treads territory which gave rise to much debate with no trace of excitement. He praises the scholarship and sincerity of many individual nonconformists. He is, in a word, a broad-minded man. And there might be an echo there to what we've already heard by Sean Aled about his contemporary, Bishop Timothy Rees. Be that as it may, it's obvious that the author possessed a genial personality and a gift to express his material in a memorable fashion. And it's surprising that Gerard Jones, who was himself a prolific author and churchgoer in 1972, knew hardly anything about him. The contribution of the former vicar of Kidwelly seemed to have disappeared into the midst of the past. Now, Ambrose Jones was 54 when he published Nodion, and this wasn't his first volume. A year earlier, in 1919, Philosophic Thought and Religion had appeared, a short handbook discussing some of the main features of the religious philosophy and psychology of the day. Some of themes of which would be repeated in the chapter on philosophy and religion in the Nodion. Between then and 1939, he would produce 5 other volumes, including his main contribution to the history of religion, A History of the Church in Wales, 1926. He began publishing when he wrote about Griffith Jones of Llanrowdod in Yr Haul in April 1893. And between that and 1950, 2 years before he died, he published over 180 articles in y Ganinen, y Vineyard, but chiefly in Yr Haul and the Cyfaill Eglwysig. These articles maintain a consistently high quality across the decades on a wide variety of subjects and with the author's civility apparent throughout. All in all, he was one of the most noted authors of the Church in Wales in the first half of the previous century, and it's a matter of regret that he's been so completely forgotten. David Ambrose Jones was born at Hendre, Kilkennin, Ceredigion, in 1866. After graduating in history at the University of Wales Aberystwyth in 1888, he enrolled at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, graduating again in modern history in 1893 before taking his MA in 1897. He was ordained deacon in 1893, serving as a curate of Llangadwch Neb in the Diocese of Llandaf, before being priested in 1895. He served as a curate in Tenby, in St Michael's, Aberystwyth, and rector of Manor Davy near Kilgerran in Pembrokeshire. He was appointed vicar of St Mary's, Kidwelly. This was a former Benedictine priory in 1914, where he remained until he retired in 1934. His name of his wife was Camilla Grace, and he retired to their daughter's home in Sketty, Swansea. And he died on the February the 12th, 1951, when he was 84 years old. Now, the 180 or more articles he wrote over a period spanning over 60 years, they may be categorized as follows. General ecclesiastical history, Welsh church history, literature, particularly prose writing from the early modern period on. Famous figures of the faith, including Augustine the Great, John Chrysostom, Thomas the Kempis, revivalists, preachers, hymn writers, Anglican writers of the 19th century, together with a series of lively portraits of characters whom he'd come across. Occasionally, He's most interesting when he recalls his experiences of days gone by. Well, it would be impossible in a short talk like this to summarize all his work. So I intend to say a little more about the nodion, then about llenyddiaeth a llenorion Cymraeg, and refer to the occasional article. Let's start then with the volume that Gerald Jones referred to, Nodion Llenyddol. It contains 17 chapters. 4 of them had appeared as articles in yr Hael, 3 in y Beirniad, and the rest hadn't been previously published. And he says this, they were the product of hours of relaxation and contemplation in the midst of a busy life. And his hope was that everyone who bought the volume would find it a fair exchange for the expense. And for many years, I have certainly found a fair exchange for what I paid, for the few pounds I paid for the book. More than half the chapters are devoted to ecclesiastical history and history of Wales, and they display considerable knowledge and insight. He's 3 very readable essays on the evangelical revivalist in Wales. That is Hywel Harris, Daniel Rowland, and William Williams. And this is what he says about Williams Pantycelyn. Williams Pantycelyn was one of Wales's greatest men. There have been better translators, more profound thinkers, more talented poets, and gifted preachers. But I believe it may be truly said that Williams is one of our nation's greats. He didn't have superficial information about the 3 of them. He's familiar with their careers, his extensive knowledge of their work, and all his comments are based on mature understanding and balanced judgment. And then what he says about Williams, say what you like, he says, referring to his great poem, Thea Memphis. This, all things considered, is the greatest epic poem in the Welsh language. It easily places him among the greatest of our poets. Now, and there are poets listening tonight. We'll see what their opinion is. Apart from poetry, the diligent author, and he quotes here, composed a number the diligent author, a number of books in clear, readable, and idiomatic prose, and amongst which were, he says, Pantheologia. That is a history of all the world's religions, and a work which displays immense scholarship. And he says, knowledgeable indeed. Williams's knowledge extended far beyond the knowledge of many thousands of today's learned men. Knowledge and scholarship characterized the chapter on John Blackwell, the poet Alun, who was his predecessor as rector of Manordeiddi 3/4 century ago and he has an excellent chapter on Richard Hooker, the author of The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. The only way that this I know of this important author in the Welsh language, while his chapter on St. Augustine links the palace of the Bishop of Hippo in the North African deserts of the 4th century with a rural vicarage in West Wales in the depth of winter of last century. He says this, when snow covered the ground, and the weather was bitterly cold, and with letters on the table awaiting replies, I suddenly had it in mind to read seriously Augustine's Confession, The book had been in my possession for some years, but I'd never read it from cover to cover in a considered and detailed manner. As far as I know, this valuable book has never appeared in Welsh. And that of course was true. You had to wait until the beginning of the 70s before that volume was translated into Welsh. But then he said, my main emphasis in this essay is to provide some kind of outline of Augustine's life, as he himself puts it in his autobiography. And this isn't the only time in this volume that Ambrose Jones's genial humanity is expressed. Let's move on then to the next volume, Llenyddiaeth a Llenorion Cymraeg. Llenyddiaeth a Llenorion Cymraeg, 1800 to 1900. It's a charming and attractive book, and the author obviously enjoyed writing it. It's divided into 4 parts, writers from 1800 to 1850, dealing first with the poets and then with the prose writers, and the same with the second half of the century, 1850 to 1900. Other poets preceding the prose writers. In 150 pages, he lists as many as 180 writers, great and small. A substantial portion of authors being those whom the late Hywel Teifi has taught us to regard as the great century. The risk, of course, is that this could turn into nothing but a catalogue, but he doesn't do this. This is what he says of Matthews Iweni, the famous preacher from the Vale of Glamorgan, and the author of that amusing book, Codfiant Siencyn Penhydd. He didn't have, Matthews, the benefit of a college education, but he did possess some genius. He adhered to the idioms of his native area and wrote in clear and unadorned Welsh. And this is what he says of Thomas Charles of Bala. His chief literary work is the Geiriadur Ysgrythurol, the dictionary. Wales never before saw a more learned and complete work as this. It's written in a flowing style, the language fluent and readable, far superior to the pedestrian and clumsy written Welsh of his period. Although it's dated, Geiriadur Charles remains new and fresh from every age. Now, Ambrose Jones was a loyal churchman, but there's no hint of partisan prejudice. This is what he says about the Baptist, Joseph Harris Gomer, the editor of the first Welsh language weekly. His style is lively and striking, and he doesn't, unlike some of the century writers, heap words upon another with no sense, seeking to follow the syntax of the English language. He always has something particular to say, and succeed in doing so succinctly, with no undue effort or frills. If he can praise when this is justified, he also knew that the century had spawned a great deal of mediocrity, and one of these mediocre peoples was David Peters, the Congregationalist from Carmarthen. His most important literary work is Hanes Crefydd yng Nghymru. This is a substantial work with hardly any organisation or craft belonging to it. The highest accolade that may be given is that the author is relatively free from the denominational blindness, which is a blight on most history books of the century. Even the Church of England is praised, but the author has nothing good to say about Catholics. One of the most remarkable facts in the whole history of Wales is that the majority of the nation became fiercely anti-papist in such a short time. And Ambrose Jones goes on to mention the works of Welsh Catholics, such as Edward Metcalfe of Talacre and Dewi Nant Bran. What is his impetus for producing his work? And this is what he says in his preface. I started seeking quite early in life about solace in the work of poets and writers of my native land. And this because I had heard young Welshmen stating boldly that Wales had no literature worth the name, and hearing Englishmen in Oxford and other places alleging that Welsh had no literature at all, or they would have heard of it. There's no doubt that it was the company of his fellow Welshmen in the Dafydd ap Gwilym Society which spurred his early researches in this field. Following his comments on Edward Annwyl, Sir John Rhys and Owen Edwards, he traces the history of the Dafydd, and he's proud of his membership of it. As Wyn the Gwyneddigion, the aim of the Dafydd ap Gwilym Society was, and he says, to resurrect the ancient treasures of the Welsh language from oblivion. Both societies did a great deal to endanger a new national feeling at a time when it was sorely needed, but its streams didn't flow entirely in the same direction. The Gwyneddigion were men in their prime who lived as merchants or other occupations in London. But the members of the Dafydd ap Gwilym Society were young lads in Oxford, starting out in life. Unlike William Owen Pugh and his friends, their aim was to restore ancient forms in accordance with the spelling and syntax of the authors of old and the vernacular of the people. After listing the names of the founders, he includes his own name among the second generation. These were formative years, and the spirit of the times is apparent in the telling. When the author of the editor of the Cyfaill Eglwysig in 1942 asked him to share his reminiscences of his college days, the excitement was still there. After arriving Corpus Christi in the Michaelmas term, 1888, a college, he says, of great standing in the university, which fostered famous men such as Hooker, Jewell, Arnold, Keble, Burgess, and others. He could be named. He joined the Dafydd ap Gwilym Society. And he says this, the society was very lively during those years. Among the members were Professor John Rhys, J. Gwenod Bryn Evans, and William Jones, who later became MP for Arfon. Rhys could be very droll sometimes, Gwenod Bryn always sharp with his wit, and William Jones with a flood of energy and fluency. There was vast enjoyment there, as well as culture, especially for the young members. That is, his contemporary J. Young Evans, J.H. Davies, David Vaughan Thomas, and others. But he also mentions other experiences when he spent 3 years in the Dreaming Spires. And he says this, my teacher in history was Owen M. Edwards of Lincoln College. I spent many hours in his company in his rooms. But I must admit that we talked about everything almost except history. We talked of Islwyn, Glas Ynys, John Jones, Glan y Gors, and the Welsh of the French Revolution. Edwards was a master stylist, but not much weight could be put on his historical theories. And I've been reading over the last few days Hazel Morford Davis's biography of O.M. Edwards, and it's surprising how sharp Ambrose Jones was talking about his old history tutor. Be that as it may, he really enjoyed himself. And the stamp of the David would be on his writing throughout his life. In my opinion, Llenyddiaeth a Llenorion Cymreig, 1800-1900, is a minor masterpiece. There's careful scholarship, and it's a pleasure to read. Why there wasn't much more mention made of it by later critics, it remains a mystery. And this is it, the book, by the way, my copy. Right, I'm looking at the clock. What happened to him is the question I asked. Together with these books, Jones continued active along the years, sharing his interests with his readers. I don't know the nature of his ministry in Kidwelly, and apart from being appointed as Canon of St David in 1930, when he was 64 years old, he had no ecclesiastical promotion. Even as a younger writer, he had a particular gift of portraying characters such as essays on Lewis Gilbertson, Vicar of Eller, Archdeacon Prothero, Vicar of St Michael's, Aberystwyth, whose curate he was, and that colourful character, George Huntington of Tenby, and he was also a curate. As he grew older, the portrayals became more nostalgic. In his essay Taith, in October 1945, he lists the places that he was familiar with in his youth. I went for a walk one day in Cardiganshire in order to visit the old communities which I knew in my youth. He doesn't just list places, Lampeter, Dyffryn Llanddewi, Aberarth, Llannon, and Llanrhystyd, but also his old friends. I thought, he says in Lampeter, about Principal Bebb, Professor Tyrrell Green, Chancellor David Jones, Canon Campbell Williams, friends of mine, but no one knows them now. And in the other places, when he characterizes the old characters, clerics and lay, he says, it is the world, this world has passed, and men's memory goes by even faster. He was an old man, living on his memories by then. And most of his contemporaries had died before him, and the memory of them was disappearing. The only comment made in the ecclesiastical press when he died in February 51 was this. Canon D. Ambrose Jones was a very dear man who died at the beginning of the year. Canon D. Ambrose Jones, formerly of Kidwelly, at 84 years of old, and had spent the last 15 years in isolation in Sketty, Swansea. His book on the history of the church in Wales is a standard, and we are greatly indebted to him for his contribution and others of his to our literature. There was no obituary of him. The Welsh Dictionary of Biography doesn't mention him, and it appears to be completely unknown to literary historians. Indeed, Tom Perry and Mervyn Morgan don't mention it in their, and even R.M. Jones mentioned nothing in his book, Llenyddiaeth Gymraeg. Indeed, there was something prophetic in his words, Ambrose's own words, when he mentioned the history of the Vicar of Ella a half a century earlier. Non-conformity ensures biographies of those who served in its ranks, so that their history will inspire others. The Church in Wales is extremely deficient in this respect and continues to be so as regards any attempt to remember any of its best men. Their names and their memory is usually left to die. Well, that's exactly what happened to him, one of the last in the of the old literary parsons. And I hope that this short talk has done something to right that wrong. And thank you for listening. Thank you. One of the things that struck me, talking about Ambrose Jones, was his description of William Jones as a flow of rhetoric. And I'm sure that many will agree with you that you have shown those characteristics as well. Are there any questions? May I invite questions from the audience? Otherwise, if I can thank Sean Aled and Denzil for their contributions, they're extremely interesting contributions. Thank you. And we really appreciate this, that you've drawn attention to two characters of the Church in Wales at the beginning of the 20th century.